Let me introduce myself. First of all, this is the first of two presentations to be made. One is today from 4:30 to 6, and the second will be next Tuesday from 4:30 to 6 for part two. For the few of you here who don't know who I am, my name is Steve Golden, and in real life, for the past 50 years, I was a dentist. We developed a passion for collecting historical newspapers. This passion began in 1969 when I was in the Air Force and my father died, and I flew back home, and my mother asked me to clean out his dressers, his closets, and everything else, and just take what I wanted and throw everything else away. And in the bottom drawer of one of his chest of drawers in his bedroom, there was a stack of newspapers that I had never seen. Growing up, I never shared that. And I pulled them out, and they were papers having to do with events in his life. He was born in 1904, so the earliest paper that was in this stack was 1918, when World War I ended. He had when Lindbergh crossed the Atlantic. He had a newspaper. Come on in. He had a newspaper when Lindbergh crossed the Atlantic. He had a newspaper when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. He had put away the moon landing, and so on. So basically, he was not a collector of newspapers. He was a person who did what a lot of people do, and that is when very important events happen, they put away the newspaper of that particular day. 9/11 is the perfect example. Everybody from most of our era put away when Kennedy was assassinated. And I took him home to Columbus, Ohio, where I was in the Air Force. And one thing led to another, and I decided to see whether or not these things were worth anything. And at the time, I was a collector of coins. So I used to subscribe to Coin World magazine, which came every week. And they have a list in the back of coins for sale. And at the very, very end of the Coin World magazine, it had a listing of non-coin items for sale. And one of the items in that list was historical newspapers for sale. And a fellow named Harry Knapp in Orange, New Jersey, I sent away for his list, said $2 away for his list. And I got a mimeograph, you all remember a mimeograph, a mimeograph list of about 16 pages of newspapers that were for sale. And these were not the kind of newspapers that my father put away. These were papers from the War of 1812, Revolutionary War, colonial America, and he had War of 1812 newspapers for $2 a piece. And I said, this must be a typographical mistake. He must have meant $200 a piece. So I'm going to buy 10 of them for $20, and I'll see if he sends them to me. Well, he sent them to me, and as my wife said, I got hooked. And I decided at that particular point in time that I was going to build the largest collection of historical newspapers in private hands. And I did. And it became a passion, and my wife would say it became an obsession. While practicing dentistry in daytime, nighttime, I would be doing my homework as far as collectible newspapers was concerned. So let me give you, I'm going to try to present to you a summary of my 50 years, actually 60 years of collecting 6 centuries of newspapers. Now, when you think of newspapers, this is what you think of for the most part. People who come from our era. Big banner headline, picture and color on the front. But you have to realize that when newspapers began, they didn't look like they do now, and they didn't read like they do now. And people in the 18th century, and the 17th century, and the 18th and 19th century had a different view of newspapers. So let me go back one slide before I go on, and I'm going to show you an event that happened in 1963 and compare it to something that happened 4 centuries earlier in the 1500s. And that is the assassination of a particular person. And even though the form of the newspaper changes over the years, the basic interest of people who read newspapers has not changed, and the display of it has not changed. What you see on the left is a famous newspaper when Ruby shoots Oswald, very, very famous photograph in the Dallas Morning News from November 25th, 1963. This over here is a illustrated news broadside from 1594, so four centuries earlier. And if you look at it carefully, the broadside shows the assassination of King Henry V. Look at the picture of Ruby going over to Oswald with his gun out. This is a picture of King Henry VIII being stabbed by the assassin. Here's what the entire broadside looks like. But even though it looks similar, and even though it looks a lot different in terms of the headline or what have you, this is exactly the same sort of a genre. It's an assassination. So there are certain things that I'm going to talk about today that transcend the centuries. People are always interested in assassinations, they're interested in war, they're interested in scandals, they're interested in gaining power in kings, the rise and fall of kings. So we're going to go ahead and talk about that. So this is what we all recognize as a newspaper. For the most part, this is not what I collect. Even though I have some of these. I have 1.5 million newspapers in my collection, and I'd say probably maybe 500,000 of them may look like this. But the great majority don't look like this. So we all remember Watergate, big banner headline, bombshell means the breaking news, the drip by drip that came along with Richard Nixon and Watergate, and finally resigned. We all remember when Vietnam was evacuated, the last Americans were evacuated from Vietnam, that famous helicopter shot. And of course, relatively recently, in the past 25 years, U.S. under attack in the 9/11 attack. Well, let's go back to the beginning. You have to remember that printing really only began, printing of movable type began in the 1500s, actually the late 1400s, early 1500s, with Johann Gutenberg. Before that, there were no newspapers as such. So there were no reporters either. So where did people who did the newspapers in the early days get their news? Well, they got them from a number of different sources. The top 10 were private letters containing matters of general interest sent to residents or to the publisher. They'd be news from ship captains who would come to the dock or the tavern, merchants receiving or sending goods by sea, travelers on sea or land, that's the news to tell. Regarding that, you have to remember there's something called a time lag in news. So something happened in Europe. We didn't hear about it in America for another at least 6 weeks and maybe more depending on what the weather was. And even if something happened later on in the United States and the fastest that news could travel was as fast as a man or a woman could walk, or as fast as a ship could sail, or as fast as a man or a woman could ride a horse. There's always a time lag in news. So when the Declaration of Independence was initially published in the Philadelphia newspaper on July the 6th, 1776, the news didn't get to Georgia until May. So that becomes important in collecting historical newspapers when you figure that in the days when the time lag in news is not what it is today, which is instantaneous, that the first place that a particular event happened is pretty much usually the most valuable newspaper. We call that the first report. You can come on in and sit down. Soldiers fighting in wars who returned from information would have news, or if they sent letters back home. Post carriers, when they had post, who picked up items on their route. News which came to the governor, from governors or officials in other colonies. This is what I like to call the official news. Official news of the colony secured from the governor and later the assembly. This is more or less propaganda, but you have to also understand that the people who were in power are the ones who really tell what the news is. If you were on the losing side of a battle, you tried to make the best of it, but you try to present the battle from your side of it. Postmasters were a major source of news, and colonial newspapers sent their newspapers to other newspapers along the route, and they would then take and reprint a particular news article that was there. So those are the top 10 sources. Now, the size of newspapers changed over the first 6 centuries. This is what we recognize today as a standard size of a newspaper. It's approximately 23 inches by 16 inches and has a big banner headline. And we're going to get into why they have big banner headlines now. But if you go back 100, 150 years, at the time of the Civil War, this is the size of a newspaper. It's about 20 inches by 15 inches. And you don't see a big banner headline like you have here. What you see over here is what's called stacked headlines. So instead of the headline being horizontal, these are vertical. And there's a reason for that, and I'm going to get to that later in the presentation. If you go back even a century before that, to the 18th century, this over here is the great-great-great-grandfather of the Eastern Star Democrat. It's the Eastern Republican Star. So that's this right here. And you see it has a very fancy masthead. And if you go back even further to the early 18th century, this is the Maryland Journal and Baltimore Advertiser, which was a newspaper printed in Annapolis, and that was even smaller still. This paper at the top might have been 16 pages, 30 pages, whatever, but a lot more pages than we have today. Matter of fact, I'm in the business now where I sell historical newspapers, and when I send papers to people and they're not used to this, they're what I call a newbie in the business, and they'll get a paper from the 18th century, it would just be a sheet of paper folded over. And there's a reason for that. We're going to get into that as well. So the old papers, the original papers, were very, very few papers. They're very thin, they're very small. They didn't get made until the late 19th, early 20th centuries. Even smaller than that is a newspaper like the London Gazette, which you see here, which is just a single sheet of paper printed on the front and the back, and that has to do with the mechanics of printing back in those days. And then below it, you see what's called a news book, the exact relation of His Majesty's fleet. That is a news book which sometimes had 2 or 3 pages, but could have up to 50 or 60 pages. But they were very different from newspapers today. Newspapers today cover a lot of different subjects. They have sports, they've got women's sections, they've got men's sections, they've got classified ads, they've got movie reviews. News books, generally speaking, are on a particular single subject. So it's not going to be all the news and everything. Now just think about this for a second. Back in the, until the early 20th century, the average person in America did not travel more than how many miles from home in their lifetime? How many miles do you think that the average person traveled?
10 miles.
7 miles was the average before automobiles and rapid transit. Most people lived in a particular area and never traveled more than 7 miles in their entire lives. Just think about that for a second. So let's think about what local news was. For the most part, unless there was a war going on, or unless you were a very wealthy person or a political elite like a king or a duke or something like that, or somebody in the economic top tier, what happened in Europe, and if you were in America, it didn't really matter because it didn't affect you all that much. If you were a guy, a serf, working or a peasant working on the land, back in feudal days in Europe, you were focused on what was happening in your particular area. You were focused on whether the master of the kingdom was going to be good to you or not good to you. He's going to feed you or not feed you. There was a war going on across the ocean. Who cared? It didn't affect you at all. So anyway, this is the difference in size of some of the early newspapers. Now let's go on to the early papers in America. The first newspaper printed in what is now the United States is Public Occurrences. You see here it says number 1. This was printed in 1690, 1690, and I believe it was 1690. And there was only one issue that was printed. And the reason why this is the first newspaper and why this over here is not the first newspaper is because of number 1. They put a number 1 on it, meaning there was supposed to be a number 2 and a number 3 and a number 4 and a number 5. The problem was in Boston in 1690, if you didn't have a license from the powers that be, you couldn't publish a newspaper. The fellow, Benjamin Harris, who printed the first newspaper, printed the Public Occurrences newspaper, and it was suppressed by the ruling political elite in Boston because it had what they thought was a licentious article about the wife of the King of France. And that wasn't allowed in the papers at that time. They thought it was blasphemy. So it was suppressed. And the next day, the rulers of Boston, the mayor and what have you, put out a broadside that said we have suppressed the Public Occurrences. Interestingly, even though this is the first newspaper in what is now the United States, until the 1950s, no copies of this existed. No one had this. Even the Massachusetts Historical Society that has everything, that was printed in Boston. Even Massachusetts Historical Society did not have a copy of that. You want to know where this was found? Believe it or not? Found at the Public Records Office in London, England. How the hell did we get there? This is very interesting because when I was associated with the Freedom Forum Museum, it was over in Washington, D.C., and when they opened in Roswell, Virginia in 1997, they arranged to have this issue, the only copy known, brought over to the United States and displayed for the first month or so that the museum was open in Roswell, Virginia. It was brought over by a person who they called a keeper. She had a handcuff around her wrist. She had a briefcase that had the handcuff attached to it. When she came over on the plane, she went to the bathroom in the plane and she had to take this case with her again. She could not leave this anyplace. She did not have the key to this. So there was no way for her to get into this. And there was a whole lot of interesting, it was very interesting about how they put it in a case, and case within a case, was insured for $1 gazillion. But it was really amazing to actually look at it in person, because I've seen many reproductions of this, but I've never seen an original, because that only original was the only one that exists. The reason why New English Affairs, which was printed a year earlier than Public Occurrences, this was also published in Boston in 1689, which was a year before Public Occurrences. The reason why New English Affairs is not the first newspaper is because there's no number on it. So without a number, there was no speculation that there was going to be more of them. So it's a news form, yes, but it's not considered the first newspaper in the United States.
Was there another one, Steve?
What's that?
Was there another one?
Another one what?
Another New English?
No,
Affairs?
that was it.
It was it.
Why is Boston News a Boston News?
I'm sorry?
Old news or old print, right?
Oh, okay, I'm going to get to that. Now, the oldest newspaper in the what is now the United States is the Boston Newsletter. And that's based on the fact that the Boston Newsletter was continuously published from 1704, which was first issue, all the way through the Revolutionary War. So this was not one that was suppressed, it was continuously published. So this is considered to be the very first newspaper in the United States that's continuously published.
The Athens.
All of these are extremely, extremely rare and extremely, extremely valuable. The earliest Boston newsletter I have is from 1708. It's the oldest one I've ever seen. This is 1704. So they're very, very scarce. The only ones I've ever seen in any quantity were in historical societies. And of course, the public occurrences really should be at the American Antiquarian Society in Boston, but the British government is not going to give it up.
So why is the
How did he get you?
Oh, okay. In colonial days, the first S in a word, the first small S in a word would be the letter F. Can't tell you why, but that happens a lot. A lot of people want to know about that, as a matter of fact. These are just examples of other 18th century United States newspapers. And you see how they have different, very fancy mastheads. Some have woodcut engravings, like the Maryland Journal, which is a Baltimore paper. The New Hampshire Gazette, again, a woodcut engraving. Engravings were very scarce in early newspapers because they were very expensive. They depended on a craftsman to either carve a design, a picture, backwards on a block of wood. Think about that for a moment, to print it. Or they did it with the copper engraving, which I'll get into later on as well.
Did they have to print it by hand on each
I'm
one?
going to get to that.
Yeah.
Some of them had pretty simple mastheads. Connecticut Courant here, 1764. Pennsylvania Packet had a very, very simple one. But some that had very, very attractive mastheads. These are 19th century, early 19th century, and these are generally not as visually attractive as the 18th century mastheads for some reason. This is how they printed newspapers and news books in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, and early 19th centuries. This was not mechanized, and they did them one at a time. Not only did they not print them in any mechanical fashion, they also had to hand make the paper. Think about that for a second. They had to take rag paper, grind it up, mix it with water, they'd press it out, get all the water out of it, flatten it out with rollers, and then they'd put it on the line like you would, like you put out laundry to dry. And some of this is called laid paper, because if you look at it, they laid it onto screens. It's like a screen door, except on a horizontal. And it would have the impression of the wires in it. And if you hold it up to the light, and if it's an 18th century paper, what you'll see is laid paper. If you see paper that is not a laid paper with a little wires looking in it, then it means it's a reproduction done later on. That's one of the ways we can tell reproductions from originals. These were done one at a time. They had to do one side. These were 4-page papers. They would print 2 of the papers on one side, they hang it up to dry, and then when it dried, they turn it over, and they would print the other side of it. All of the type was set by hand. This was no linotype. There was no digitalization. They actually had to put these in one letter at a time. And I'm old enough to remember taking printing in junior high, Garrison Junior High School. And I was saying, I can't believe people actually do this. But they just, so it's very, very labor intensive. And they didn't print that many papers back in these days because the only people who would be interested in news would be the elite, the rulers, political elite, the economic elite, somebody who was in the military, at the top of the military chain. You also have to remember that in those days, most of the population could not read. So we're going to go back and show what happened in Europe to get the information and the news to people who couldn't read. This is a 1502 illustrated news broadside. A broadside you're going to hear me talk about along the way in this lecture series. Broadside is a single sheet of paper. It's blank on the back. So they printed it on one side, and they would print it in black and white. Somebody would take and make an engraving, usually a woodcut engraving like you see here, and there would be text at the bottom in whatever the language was, for that particular area. This happens to be in German, I believe. And this actually is one of the earliest news broadside showing Europeans what Native American Indians look like. Just think about that for a second. You're basically in a time machine. You can go back to 1502 and you can look at and read what happened, what Europeans saw when they saw this news broadside hung up on the wall somewhere. Now, the interesting thing about this is that the person who actually engraved this had never been to America. He didn't really know what American Indians looked like. All he knew was a description given by sailors that had come back from America, and they described what the Native American Indians looked like. But the person who engraved it had no idea, so he made the Indians look like Europeans. These are European-looking people. But, I mean, you have to think about it, that's all they knew about. These look like Germans and Italians, and the ships are very, very relatively small, so the perspective. And of course, the Indians are in the spots, so they showed the Indians as being naked, except they had a little fig leaf on top of them to hide their, privates, and you see them all over there. So it's very, very interesting. This is a very, very, very desirable and a very, very expensive item. It's in a museum now. I don't think very many of these exist.
Why is it in color?
Well, a lot of them were not hand colored, but over the years, some person who might have had access to it might have said this would be a lot better if it was in color. But most of them are not colored. I'm going to show you that in a few slides as well. I'll show you colored and uncolored. This is a 1592 Neue Zeitung. You're going to see a number of Neue Zeitungen. Right here it says Neue Zeitung in German. This is an illustrated news book. It is not the first illustrated newspaper book, but it's got an illustration on it. And these are stock illustrations. They're basically woodcut engravings that they would put in a drawer, and they would make a picture of a town, and they would put these on a number of different woodblocks, different news books, so they didn't have to have the craftsman who crafted this redo it over and over again. I don't know exactly what this is about, what the text is about, because I don't read the early German, but basically speaking, that this gives you an idea as to what these early news books looked like. They were on a single subject. They didn't have general news. They didn't have sports sections and financial sections or what have you. This was just a news book telling you this is what happened in a particular city that you may be familiar with. But again, these were bought mainly by the elites. They were not bought by the average person on the street. They were relatively expensive at the time because of that.
Stephen, how many pages would it be?
They vary. They can be, I've seen them with 2 pages. I've seen them, when I say 2 pages, 2 sheets of paper, 4 sides. I've seen them with 60, 70, 100 pages. So it really varies. Now we're going to see that later on as well. At the same time as news books were in, people who were active in commerce needed to know the news from around Europe. Because for those days, Europe was the world as far as Europeans were concerned. So people who were involved with the various commercial interests needed to know if there was a war somewhere, because if there was, they wanted to keep their ships either away from there, or they wanted to supply arms to them and make some money, or they wanted to send food if there was a famine going on and get paid for that. So people who were in the economic elite or the political elite, kings and queens, needed to know what was going on. People in the economic elite, like a fellow named Jacob Fugger, right here, hired people around Europe in different countries. And they would take and write a letter to Jacob Fugger, only to Jacob Fugger, not anybody else. So it was your own private newsletter. And these people in Turin, Italy, and Paris, France, and London, England, and other places would send these letters to Fugger, and he would find out what's happening in different countries around Europe, which for the economic elite, was basically the world. These are called the Fuga newsletters. They are also extremely, extremely rare, very hard to find. Same thing happened in Italy, and they were called gazettas. That's the Italian word for newspaper, and that's where you get the word gazette from. A lot of the newspapers today are Boston Gazette, the Portsmouth Gazette, and so on. This is where that word came from. So not only do you have early news books, you have early newsletters as well. To show you that people don't change over the years. The one thing I've learned in historical newspapers is that although the dress changes, and our foods change, and our modes of transportation changes, our basic interests don't change. 7 deadly sins, all this stuff. People are interested in murders, sex, scandals, wars, famine, goes throughout the ages. They just have a different way of showing it. So this, can you go back to the 12? This just shows a news book from 1566 with pictures of a massacre, and you can see them cutting people up and throwing them in piles here. Again, there's that word again, new Zeitung. That's latest news in German.
Is that a wood carving also?
That's a woodcut engraving, yes. Now you'll see others that are copper plate engravings. I'm going to show you those later on. Copper, just to show you, woodcut engraving, you had to have a person who was artistically skilled, who could carve backwards. They used a mirror. They would take and carve in that wood block backwards and leave certain parts of it higher than others. And when they printed it, it would come up to show you this. In terms of a copper plate engraving, you have a very flat copper plate. And they would cover the plate with wax. And they would take a stylus and they would draw a picture in it, a very detailed picture. And then they would pour acid onto it. And what would happen is that the copper that came in contact with the acid would be etched away. Then you wash it off with water after a certain period of time, and then you would take the wax off. And what you have is an engraving that could be put up against a piece of paper, and you could print something with it because of the difference between where the acid and weight part of it and where it was had highlights. Usually the copper plate engravings are finer than the woodcut engravings, because in the woodcut engraving you have to take into consideration the grain of the wood. And some of them you'll see, actually be able to see the grain of the wood. They also had illustrated news broadsides. This is a copper plate engraving. You see how fine detail it is. This is the Battle of Lepanto that took place in 1573. There was a gentleman named Franz Hogenberg, you can see his name up here, who was in Germany, who was a very, very fine creator of these copper plate engravings. Not necessarily news in the beginning, but they were just copper plate engravings of a bird or something like that. And what he did was he thought it would be great if we could take events that happened relatively shortly after they happened. When I'm talking about relatively shortly in the 16th century, I'm talking about a month, 2 months, 3 months, 5 months down the road. But this was a way that people who couldn't read, people who were illiterate, could see what was going on. It was also a way that the ruling elites, the political elites and the economic elites, could get their point of view over to a population who couldn't read. So what you see here is the naval battle of Lepanto. Most people have never heard of this, but it's important because it is the last major naval battle in history that was fought with galleys. That is galley slaves rowing sort of thing. And you can see the galleys there. There was a face-off between the Muslims, between Islam and Christianity off the coast of Italy. This is a German language news book from 1588. This is 16 years after the Battle of Lepanto. This is one of the most momentous and most important major events in world history. It's the defeat of the Spanish Armada by the English. And the reason why it's so important is that this marked the end of Spain as the predominant power in Europe and in the New World, and the beginning of the rise of England as the #1 power in the world, all the way up from the 1500s, all the way to the 1940s when World War II sort of took them out of the game. The saying that the sun never sets on the British Empire has to do with the fact that it drew out of this battle. And this came out of the battle came out of a very big mistake made by the King of Spain, who wanted to defeat England, and his advisor said that's not a very good thing to do, but he knew everything, so he was going to send his fleet over. He sent the fleet over from Spain to England, which is really not that far when you look at it. And the English had spies who knew that they were coming, and they tried to sail up the channel. The problem was that once the Spanish fleet got in the channel, they had to keep going around England. Of course, up in the Irish Sea, the weather is terrible. And what happened was the Spanish fleet sailed into the English Channel. The English sent fireboats. They had these old wrecks that they took and they put out, they set them on fire, and they waited until the wind was right, set them on fire, and these fireboats blew up against the Spanish Armada, and they burned a lot of them. And to get away from the Spanish Armada, to get away from the English, the Spanish Armada had to flee northward because that's the way the wind was blowing. Didn't have engines in those days, it would go by sail. And the weather up in the Irish Sea was terrible. Spanish fleet was, in essence, destroyed for the most part. And that was the beginning of the end of that. So you have a news book here. And what's really interesting about it is it's in German. It says Spanish Armada, or Krieg, which is Spanish Armada War Fleet, Krieg. It has a stock picture that supposedly shows the Spanish Armada, but it's one of those stock pictures like I showed you for the early German news book. And this is 1588. But you have to be able to read to understand this. So Hodenberg said, well, this is another one. This is another news book, a lot longer, without an actual picture of the Spanish Armada. And this was a copy of a letter sent out. The name of this is a copy of a letter sent out of England in the time that the Spanish Armada was on the seas. And this basically copies a letter written by one of the Spanish diplomats in England at the time, who wrote the letter that was published in a news book. And again, it was just one subject. It wasn't a whole lot of subjects. Hodenberg, the fellow I told you about before, who did the Spanish Armada, did the Battle of Lepanto, he recognized the fact that this was a very famous event in world history, and he had an engraving of that. Defeat of the Spanish Armada by the British naval fleet. And you can see the smoke over here from the ships. Right here, there's smoke from the fire ships. And take a look at the bottom. You see at the bottom here, there's words. He also had the idea that if you put text there and you had an illiterate population, if you made the words rhyme, they would remember it. Think about the songs that you remember from when you were teenagers. You probably know every word from it. If I asked you to sing a song from Hamilton, you wouldn't be able to do it. But when you were a teenager, when you were 16, 17, 18 years old, you remember all the words, Great Balls of Fire, Love Me Tender, that kind of stuff. And he recognized the fact that people were able to remember it if you could do it in rhyme. Somebody asked me about why they hand colored it. Well, they did it. You could have it both hand colored, or you could have it in the black and white form. Black and white was the earlier one. The color ones came later. But I think the color ones look better. But from a standpoint of value and the first report of things, it's always the black and white edition is the earliest of it. So this might have been published, the Spanish Armada's defeat was in early 1588. This might have been 6 months later, but still, this was breaking news for Europe at the time, given the time lag in news. And again, this just shows you a difference between the colored and the uncolored. To our modern eye, most of us like the way the hand-colored book. But to a collector, you want the earliest form of it, and that's the black and white. This is the news broadside I showed you before, and I compared it to the shooting of Oswald by Ruby. This is the assassination of King Henry IV of France. This is during the French wars of religion between the Protestants and Catholics. And again, this is a broadside by Franz Hogenberg. You can see he's now got more text at the bottom. This also rhymes in the German language. Interestingly enough, it shows the assassination by the knifing in the back of King Henry IV. But in these little panes of windows here, it shows you what they did to the assassin after they caught him. This is just to show you the text over here that's in rhyme. This is the knifing of the King Henry IV, and they drew and quartered him. Not a very good way to be executed. They tied arms and legs to 4 horses, and they would all take off in different directions. In the late 1500s, that's the 16th century, there was a fair that was held twice a year in Cologne, Germany. And all the merchants, the mercantile people would get together and come to this fair from all over England and France and Spain and Germany and Eastern Europe and what have you, Russia. And they get together to make deals, sell things, buy things. So someone came with an idea in 1595, let's sell something that all these people who are coming together from all the places all over Europe would be able to buy, and they could tell what happened in Europe over the past 6 months since we last met. And what you see here is what's called the Mercurius Gallobelgicus, in Cologne, Germany. Is the earliest regularly published newsbook periodical. This was published every 6 months with regularity. So now you're starting to see newsbooks that were based on one particular subject were printed whenever that particular event happened. Earthquake, fire, war. This is when this was published on a regular basis. So people coming to the fair would know, I'll be able to buy this newsbook, Mercurius Gallobelgicus. It's about this thick. It's very, very thin. And anyway, it's the first regularly published newsbook periodical. The first regularly published newspaper that's thought about as a newspaper, although it's really a news book, is a German language Relation aller Vermenning und Reflektorwerken Historien, printed first in 1605. If you live in Europe and you collect historical newspapers, this is the Holy Grail. This is what they all want. If you live in America and you collect historical newspapers, you want public occurrences, number 1, 1690. Well, yes, you want 1690. This is almost impossible to get. Not only have I never owned this, I've never even seen one of these. And I've been looking for this stuff for 60 years. Hard to find. The only ones I ever know exist are in museums now. You'd have illustrated news broadsides that would be published and printed when an event of a celestial event happened, like a comet would appear, where you'd have a meteor shower, and it would show the people in the town. Some of them will be hand-colored, some will be not. Again, look at the top, New Zeitung, right here. So it shows a meteor shower, has text down at the bottom. It shows a natural phenomenon event. Again, you would see this if you had an eclipse, they would have a news broadside with that. Easy for the peasants to look at and say, yeah, I know what happened. the elite would be able to take and read the text at the bottom. People are always interested throughout the ages in bandits, people who wanted to overthrow the king or the queen, people who wanted to do a coup d'etat against the state. And what you see here is a news book printed in 1606. It's a true and perfect relation. A lot of the early English news books were called relaciones, relation on a particular event. And this happens to be the Guy Fawkes gunpowder plot that blew up Parliament. This had to do with the battling between King Henry VIII and the Protestant, between the Catholics and the Protestants in England to establish the Church of England. And Guy Fawkes wanted to blow up the Parliament to change the religion back to the Catholic religion. And he and his men secreted gunpowder in barrels underneath the Parliament, but they were found before it actually was able to be blown up. And this is a news broadside showing what happened to them. Again, this is Guy Fawkes and his co-conspirators. Guido Fawkes, right here. They took them to the place of execution by sleds. They cut their heads off, which you can see here, and they put their heads on spikes as a warning to the other people in the kingdom.
Steve,
Yes,
when did you say they would have colored that?
it could have been right away, it could have been 10 years after that, could have been 50 years later. There really is no way I can tell. Even the experts say that they really can't tell.
So
But
when they published it originally in color?
it was originally published not in color.
In black and white.
If it's black and white, you know it was original, untouched. So purists don't like the colored ones.
No.
They don't like that. But again, the Armada 9, it's really very, very interesting.
Did somebody color it by hand?
Yes,
Okay.
we're going to get to something later on where I'm going to talk about hand coloring of this. And I want you to remember these broadsides where you see a picture at the top and text at the bottom. We're going to get into that in the American newspapers as well. The earliest English language newspapers were actually not printed in England because there was a law against printing newspapers in England. So they were printed in the freest country for freedom of speech at the time, which was Amsterdam in the Netherlands. These are called courantos. And that's why the Harvard Courant today is called the Harvard Courant. It was named after Couranto. This is another one, Courant, or news from Italy, Germany, so on, 1691. Now, if you see in news, there's no W there, is there? And that's because in 1621, there was no W. So they took and they put two V's next to each other.
Steve, so they couldn't publish in England, but they were allowed to distribute, or that?
They were not allowed, they had to be actually smuggled in England.
Oh.
That's a good point. So the first English language newspapers were actually printed in Amsterdam, not in England.
When did they become legal in England?
I'll show you that. We're going to get to that. Again, this is just an example of an early German newsbook from 1621. These are courantos. You notice it has a number on it, which is why it's a newspaper. It's really a news book, but it's a newspaper. Number 42. So as long as it's got a number and a continuation of publication over a period of time, it's considered a newspaper. In the 1640s, 1640 through 1649, it was the English Civil War. Most people in this country have never heard of the English Civil War, but had a lot to do with a lot of people from England actually coming over to America to flee from the fighting going on during the English Civil War between the Parliament and the King. And of course, the English Civil War ended with the capture of the king, which was King Charles I. He was tried. This is a news book, number 3. And this actually has the coverage of the trial of the King of England, Charles I. And it has his sentence of death. It's interesting that this is really a big banner headline for the time, for the front page. It's a small news book, it's only about this big. But that's a really, really huge headline for the time.
Steve,
Yeah.
can you go back to that one? Did they run out of letters sometimes, and that's why they used other things, like trial has a Y, justice has an S, but they
No,
put
no,
S's in other places.
No, in those days, just like the F is a substitute for S, sometimes they would substitute an I. Interestingly enough, they didn't have a J at the time, so they used the I.
But when they use two versions of S in the same, some of the S's.
No, you
Did
would
they
know
just
this.
run out of letters?
If you were, they didn't run out of letters. You would know this if you were alive in England and you were in the elite and you were reading newspapers and newspapers, you would know that this is J, not a I. And you would know that this is a S and not an F right up here.
Right.
You would know that.
Okay, that's not my question. My question is, why isn't an F in justice, but in sentence it's an S?
Or sitting.
Yeah, that's why I'm wondering if they ran out of S's, so they used an F for
Are you
it.
talking about solicitor here? Why is that an S?
Well, in
Well,
sentences of
well,
death, sentences of, yeah, death has an S.
Because if it was I'm telling you this from what my understanding of it. I didn't grow up in that time and I don't know what the rules of grammar were. By the way, I just heard that you can now use a preposition at the end of a sentence and it's considered to be a good thing to do. Anyway, there are rules about this, about how you're supposed to use an S or an F or a J or a I. If you notice trial is TRYAL instead of an I.
Right, yeah, that's what made me
When
think
when
they
you
ran
read
out.
Old English, it's very hard to read, it really is. Anyway, getting along with this,
Well, I could see it, but I don't think we should go.
what's that?
NG,
I'm sorry?
England, King of England. It's NG, sorry, NG.
Oh, yeah, there's no
Is that,
E.
is that a typo?
Right below death, big word death.
Oh, keep going. It has to do with putting the letters, the way they have set the letters up. They only had a certain amount of space to put these letters up. So if they ran and they had no more space, they couldn't take and reduce the size of it like we do on a computer today. So they had to figure out a way to do it, and they just left out a letter.
And I think, I suspect too, that we've got all these different font sizes, and maybe they ran out of that letter for that
No.
font size.
Anyway, in the inside of the news book, the fini at the end tells you it's the end of the news book. But in the end, it says Charles Stuart, Charles I, that tyrant, traitor, murderer, and a public enemy shall be put to death by the severing of his head from his body. People love reading that sort of stuff. They do today. People are into sensationalism. The earliest, very, very large disaster to happen in Europe that we're aware of, and it was news, was the Great Fire of London in 1666. This is an illustrated news broadside, extremely, extremely rare, hand-colored, with a map of the Burton district, an engraving showing the fire, and with the text of it in German, in French, and also in English. Exquisitely rare item. It's about this big right here. It's gorgeous, very gorgeous item. Again, this is an illustrated news broadside. It has to do with a war going on in Europe. Doesn't matter which war it was, they're all the same, showing shells being lobbed into a city with text at the bottom. So remember this for later on. We're going to show you other things as well. You asked me what the first newspaper in England was actually the London Gazette. And it was first published in 1665, but for the first 21 issues, it was called the Oxford Gazette, not Oxford, Maryland, but the Oxford Gazette of Oxford, England. Issue number 22 was the London Gazette. Does anybody want to speculate on why it was published in Oxford for the first 21 issues?
University?
Nope. Something terrible was going on in Europe at the time.
Like-
Plague. And the king and his family and his court all went to Oxford, and they figured they would be away from the plague in this big city, and they published it as the Oxford Gazette, and then on issue number 22, they moved back to London, and from there on in, it became the London Gazette. The London Gazette is the longest continuously published newspaper in the world today. It is still published. All it is government directives. It's not a newspaper as we know it, as it was back in these days, but it was a newspaper. Today, it's a newspaper that publishes government proclamations and things like that. But it started in 1665, and it's still being published in 2024. You have to remember that back in the 1600s, that the British North American colonies were not the United States, and they were not America as we think of it today. They were different colonies, Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia, and so on and so forth. These were, for all intents and purposes, different countries. But they were all ruled by England. And England was interested in what was going on in their colonies, so they published news from America about King Philip's Indian War in New England, which was one of the earliest Indian wars. And it was important because that had to do with people in England would be interested in it, because if you were sending over goods from finished goods from England, and you were sending over raw materials from America, which was the mercantile system at the time, you wanted to know if there was a big Indian war going on in America, how were the colonists faring, were they being wiped out, or were they holding their own? So this was a very famous printing of this King Philip's Indian War. The other thing you ought to realize is there is no headlines in this. And that's because the people who were elite enough to read newspapers and could afford to buy them read the entire paper. They didn't have to buy them off the stands. They didn't have to be attracted to them with headlines or pictures or color pictures or things like that. This is the same Indian War, King Philip's War, but instead of a newspaper, it's a news book, brief history of the war with the Indians in New England. The interesting thing about this is that at the very end of it, after they had published it, news came in on a ship, so they published a postscript. So they put an extra page at the back of the book. That makes all the difference in the world to a collector. Just think about that. It's like you get breaking news on the internet today. I still remember when I woke up in 1997, and when I turned my computer on, it said, Princess Diana dead. This is the equivalent of that in terms of breaking news. Again, public occurrences. That's the first issue of the only issue of the paper, first paper printed in what is now the United States. This is a London Gazette. Of course, we're all interested in criminals and crimes and things like that. This is a London Gazette from 1701. It has the trial of Captain William Kidd, the pirate, and he was sentenced to death to be hanged by the neck until he died, and he was. Captain Kidd was a very, very misunderstood pirate. He was actually given a privateer's license by the governor of Virginia, who wanted him to go out there and attack French ships, which he did. If you were a privateer, you had a proclamation from the King of England or Commonwealth of Virginia governor, you could go out there and you were thought of as a pirate. You were actually a private navy. You would go out and attack French ships or Dutch ships or whatever, and you got to keep 80% of whatever the goods were that you captured on that ship. And that was how the European powers developed navies here in the United States. And he crossed the governor of Virginia somewhere along the line. He didn't give him his fair share. So the governor of Virginia got it. And Captain Kidd was brought in as a pirate, hanged, and his body was hung up at the wrapping dock in London, his head and the rest of his body was in a cage. And they let him stay there until he rotted as a sign to the others not to get hurt. One of the earliest wars in the American colonies was the first of a number of French and Indian wars. We all think of the French and Indian Wars being 1754 through 1763, but there were really 4 or 5, depending on how you define it, French and Indian Wars. This was one of them. The wars that are fought here in the American colonies were named after the ruler of Great Britain at the time. So the first war started in 1702. Queen Anne was the queen at the time, so we call this Queen Anne's War. And this is a declaration of war against France and Spain by Queen Anne. This is a huge banner headline at the time. If you look at it today and you see it and you say, gee, it's small type. It is, but to a person in the early 18th century, this would have been huge. Declaration of war. This is the first continuously published newspaper in what's to become the United States of America. This is my own copy from my own collection. This is the Boston Newsletter. That was the one I told you about. It was the first continuously published one. You can see the number up here, continuously. And it's 729, 1718. And this basically has type talking about the trial of Major Bonnet, Steve Bonnet. They called him the gentleman pirate. He was born to a very wealthy family, took up piracy, got captured. They were going to hang him. He escaped from jail with the help of some of his compatriots. They captured him again, brought him back, and they hanged him. And there's a very famous photograph of him being hanged with they gave him what's called a nosegay. So it's flowers that the executed person got the whole while they were being executed. I'm not quite sure what the rationale of that was. But there was also a news book or a newspaper that was printed monthly in Europe called The Present State of Europe, or the Historical and Political Monthly Mercury. That was a true newspaper in the sense that it was published monthly. And again, you have to realize that in these days, with transportation and the transmittal of news, you didn't have that the bulk of news coming in that you do today. But this basically was political news, news of wars, and it would be broken down into sections rather than sports, financial, what have you. This was broken down into countries: Germany, Russia, England, France, Spain, Netherlands, and so on. And it was put out monthly. This is from 1722. This has to do with the battle and the killing of the very famous pirate Bartholomew Roberts, who was known as Black Bart. They found him off the British Navy sent ships after him. They finally found him off the coast of Africa. There was a big battle, and they killed him and captured the crew and sunk the ship.
You just explained a line in the movie A Christmas Story that I never understood.
What was the
When
line?
the kid gets his BB gun, he's looking for Black Bart. He's going to kill Black Bart.
Oh, yeah.
I never knew who
There you
Black
go.
Bart was.
This is a newspaper, the New York Weekly Journal. It's very famous because it was published by John Peter Zenger. Any of you ever heard of John Peter Zenger? John Peter Zenger was the person whose trial ended with the principle of the freedom of the truth being the defense against life in this country. He was tried in New York. John Peter Zenger was the editor of the publisher of the second newspaper in New York State, the New York Weekly Journal. And he was arrested by the Governor Cosby, I believe it was, of New York, for having published things that were said about the governor of New York that were not very nice. And the governor said, "You can't say that about me." And Zenger said, "Yes, I can." The governor said, "I'm going to arrest you." And in fact, John Peter Zenger was arrested. He was put in a cell. He was held there for a year before his trial came up. They were going to try him for blasphemy. And John Peter Zenger's wife came to the jail every day, and he would dictate to her through a hole in the door, and she would write these things down, and she published his newspaper. She became the first female publisher of a newspaper in what is now the United States. And this is his paper. This is the earliest map, illustrated map, in an American newspaper. It's not very small, it's not very detailed, but it's very, very important from the standpoint of the development of newspapers and the development of the typography and the visualization of newspapers, because it is the first map in an American newspaper. This is published by John Peter Zenger, the person I just told you about. This is the Join or Die cartoon. This actually appeared in the Pennsylvania Gazette, published by Benjamin Franklin on May 24th, 1754. And this is the first political cartoon ever in an American newspaper. Extremely, extremely valuable. Very, very rare. It's actually came as a 6-page edition rather than 4-page, and most of the ones that exist, they do not have the pages 5 and 6, the last page of it, which is basically devoted to advertising, which has the Franklin imprint on it. This is one that does have the Franklin imprint on back pages. But again, if you look at this thing, the population that is relatively illiterate, if you want to get the concept of join or die together, get together, guys, or else we're going to lose this war. This sort of tells it all. I mean, New England is the head, got New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina. We lived in Georgia at the time to speak of. It just shows you that if you don't get together and work together, we're all going to die separately. This is 1759. This is the Boston Newsletter, and it's a local. When I say local, I mean it's local to the British North American colonies. This has news of the Battle of Quebec during the French and Indian War. This is in the same category as the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588, because what this battle did, where the British were able to conquer besiege and then conquer the town of Quebec in what is now Canada, was the event that turned around the French and Indian War and made it so the predominant power in North America was not going to be the French as it was, it's going to be the English. If the French had held on to Quebec, we might be speaking French right now rather than speaking English. But this battle changed the entire thing. Maryland Gazette, this was printed right down the road here in Annapolis. I showed the screen, it wasn't printed. They did have illustrations, but not in newspapers for the most part in these days. They had a magazine called Gentleman's Magazine. It was printed monthly. It was about 5 inches by 3 inches, had about 60, 70 pages in it, varied, and it had blank back engravings on the inside of it. And a lot of them had maps. And these were the earliest maps where Europeans could see what things in the Americas looked like. And this is an example of a blank back map. You see how it's not very detailed because at the time, nobody knew what was out here. Most of the Mississippi River, the losing clock went out there. For those of you who live in the Chesapeake Bay area, there's Chesapeake Bay right here. Notice Oxford's not on it. Easton's not on it. But you can make out Florida.
How did they know that there was something west of the Mississippi?
Because Native American Indian, they called it Louisiana at the time, and it was owned by France. And the French people had been in there, but they hadn't gone there and done a total survey of it. But anyway, Gentleman's Magazine is very, very interesting. It started in 1733, and it went all the way up through the 1840s or so. But the more valuable ones are the ones from the French and Indian War and the American Revolution that had maps in them. The maps are the most valuable parts of that. In 1765, the British placed a tax on printed items, and this is when the stamp tax was begun. It was actually passed in March or April of 1765 because of the time lag in news didn't come over to the United States, to America, until May, and this is news of the Stamp Act coming over. This, for the time, is a very, very big story. But notice again, there's no headline, because the people who would read this read the entire paper. This is the breaking news of the repeal of the Stamp Act a year later. You can see it right here. And you notice how the type is a little bit bigger than this over here. The repeal of the Stamp Act was very, very big news at the time because it really made an effect not only on the newspapers, but also on legal documents, things that you bought and sold a house, you had to have a stamp on it.
Was there any opinions expressed in this?
What's that?
Was there any opinion expressed in this?
Yes. Matter of fact, the newspaper, where most of your opinions were published, first of all, they were affected by it, and they had to pay the tax and increase the cost of the newspaper by a lot. And in these days, the newspapers were not a lot of them printed. There were not a lot of them, the public at large usually didn't read them, it was mostly the elites. So they did have their political debates here. A lot of these newspapers were actually placed in coffee houses. I guess they would be Starbucks of the 18th century, where people would get together, they'd have coffee, and they'd have newspapers there, they'd read them, and then they would argue verbally. And they also would do it in the newspaper. Yes. The Boston Massacre in 1770 was, of course, big news. If you notice something here, you see how they have these big black lines? In the 18th century, if someone prominent died, or if an event happened that they wanted to say this was a terrible thing, they would do what they call turned rules. The lines, see these lines right here that go up and down vertically? They're shaped triangularly. The metal is shaped triangularly. So if you have the flat side, the big side down the bottom, you're just going to see a very narrow line. If you turn it over so that the top of the pyramid is down, then you're going to see the bottom much wider part of the metal. And these are called mourning, M-O-U-R-N-I-N-G rules, which they would show people in the 18th century that someone had died, generally, or there was a very sad event that happened, like the Boston Massacre. So when you see mourning rules, you know somebody died, for the most part. This is the Boston Gazette from 1763, and this is a front page article. You can't see headlines on this, but this is two columns with the public meetings in Massachusetts to decide what to do about the tax on imported British tea. And these meetings, of course, led directly 3 days later to the Boston Tea Party. One more thing I forgot to tell you. Generally speaking, in the 18th century and all the way up through the early 19th century, for the most part, newspapers were printed weekly. They were not printed daily, because enough news didn't come in daily to really make it worthwhile. So they would print them weekly. So when the news came in, it might be 4, 5, or 6 days before the actual breaking news would be printed. In 1775, right before the battles of Lexington and Concord, they took the lead from Benjamin Franklin and his Join or Die cartoon, and they came up with a Unite or Die. This is not exactly the same as the Join or Die, which was 20-some years earlier, but this is also a very valuable newspaper because it's not only a masthead, like you see here, it's also a political cartoon. And it was thought of that way in the 18th century. This is a news broadside. It's blank on the back. It's about 12 inches by about 7 inches. And this has what for the 18th century was a banner headline, Interesting Intelligence, April 22nd, 1775. These are the battles of Lexington and Concord. And this is breaking news. Remember, I talked about the fact that there's a time lag in news. So the battles of Lexington and Concord happened on April the 19th, 1775. This broadside was printed on April the 22nd, so it's 3 days later. So it's Norwich, Connecticut. So it took 3 days for the news to get from Lexington and Concord down to Norwich. Remember, I talked about the fact that they only printed newspapers weekly. If the next newspaper was going to be on April the 25th, for example, and the news was just so momentous that they wanted to have it out there in between the editions, they would print what they call a news broadside, and that's what this is. So it would be an extra edition, like breaking news you see on CNN or some of the other things, and it would be news of important events. And of course, Lexington and Concord actually begins the American Revolutionary War.
Steve, just a heads up.
Okay.
Clock is slow.
This is the Battle of Bunker Hill, and the interesting thing about it is it's in the local newspaper, Cambridge, Maryland. Cambridge, Massachusetts. This paper this is a broadside extra. Remember I said that if it was breaking news, they would take and publish it in a blank back paper as a postscript. This was printed independently of the newspaper. It was printed in between the week when the newspaper was going to come out. And the breaking news was so momentous, they actually took and they have a postscript for it. There's a lot of different names for these. They're called postscripts, they're called extraordinaries, they're called extras, that sort of thing. The interesting things about this paper, the New England Chronicle from Cambridge, Massachusetts, is it was printed the same day that the Battle of Bunker Hill happened. And it was printed on the 22nd. The battle took place on the 22nd. And this is news that was printed while the battle was still going on. Think about that for a second. That's really breaking news from the 19th or the 18th century. We're going to stop here with the Declaration of Independence, and we'll pick up next week with that at 4:30. But we've got about 10 minutes left, so I thought I'd open up the floor for questions. If anybody here or anybody on the out there in the Netherlands has a question, shoot. Anybody have a question about any of this? Yes.
How do you store all your?
Can you repeat the question for the people?
Okay, the question was, how do you store all these papers?
Yeah.
The answer is very carefully. I have a warehouse, and I have shelves. I have them in orders that I can find them.
And the fire department's very close.
What's that?
And the fire department's nearby.
Well, we don't like to think about that.
Humidity control or archival sheets around them or protect?
Well, that's interesting you say that. The answer is no.
What was the question?
The question was, do you have archival sheets around? I keep the ones that are the most important in my collection. I keep in Mylar envelopes. They are they're different sizes depending on the size of the paper. And they're made of Mylar, which does not react to the paper. The reason why the papers from the 1600s and 1700s and 1800s look really good is because they're printed on rag paper. It's like printing on a piece of cloth. The reason why papers after 1878, 79, and up to the present day turn yellow and they look awful is that they're printed on a cheap pulp paper. And that cheap pulp paper has something in it called tannin, and also has sulfur dioxide. If you mix sulfur dioxide with water, you get sulfuric acid, H2SO4. I remember that from my chemistry thing. And what happens is over time it eats away. So the things that are harmful to any paper, including newspapers, is high temperatures, high humidity, and light. You want to keep them away from high temperatures, you want to keep them away from high humidity, and you want to keep them away from light the best you can. So I keep these rules. I'm not, although museums and libraries are temperature controlled, it's extremely expensive to do that, and I can't afford to do that. It's just momentously expensive. And you not only have to have the equipment for it, you also have to keep checking it. You also have to have somebody come in and make sure it's like a sterilizer in a dental office. You have to have people check it every week and send it in to see that it's working properly. You have to do that with your temperature and humidity and what have you. But the most important thing is to keep it away from light. The biggest mistake people make when they buy historical papers from me and they want to display them is they don't put them behind UV resistant glass, number one, which you should do. They don't use archival framing materials that are free of acid-free matting. And they put them up on a wall that sometime in the daytime, sun comes up and it's right on that paper. That'll destroy it over time. I don't care what kind of glass you have. If you have enough sunlight on it for enough time, it will fade. As many of you have had clippings put on a wall. And the other thing I've learned over the years is, if you go up in the morning and there's no sun up there to shine on your thing, you come back at 12 o'clock noon or 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock through that particular window, and it's right on your newspaper. So you have to keep them away from light. Anybody else have any questions?
Do you have a book you recommend on the history of newspapers?
I've been asked many times that question, and I've been asked many times, why don't you write the book? The answer to the second question is, I don't have enough time to do that. I'm so busy right now. I retired from dentistry approximately 2016. I practiced dentistry from 1968 all the way through 2016. But the last 16 years I was practicing dentistry, I was only practicing 1 day a week. My friends all told me that you really hadn't retired, you just didn't know it, because I was in the historical newspapers since 1997. So there is no really good book on collecting historical newspapers. And if I live long enough, maybe I'll write a book. But I don't have the fire in my belly to do it. I just don't want to do it. It's the kind of thing, if you write a book, it's not going to sell very many copies, and that's not going to sell very many copies. This is not Stephen King material, Jay Patterson, Clyde Cussler. It's for a very specialized audience. And you can sell 100 of them, 200, 500 at the very most. And you put a lot of time in to do that, you're not going to get a great monetary reward. Interestingly enough, I did write a book. When did the Titanic movie come out? Was it 1985 or thereabouts? Something like that. When the 1985 Titanic movie came out, I did a book of famous front pages of the Titanic. I took them from my collection and I put them together in a book about 150 pages or so, all the way from the building of the Titanic to its sinking in the aftermath of it. And each page is the front page of a newspaper with the Titanic. And I did it because somebody suggested to me, why don't you do a book on the Titanic? And I said, not a bad idea. It's not hard to do. You don't have to write a lot of stuff. You just have to get the pictures, you put them in a book, and I did that. And we took it to a publisher. He said, yeah, we'll go ahead and do it. And you're probably not going to sell very many. We sold over 100,000 of them. And the guy who published it said, you hit a grand slam home run. I said, this was dumb luck. I didn't know the movie was coming out. I just did this, and all of a sudden, so not only did we sell a lot initially when the movie came out, when they released the movie, years later, they re-released it, and we got another huge sale of these things. So the saying that I use is that even a blind pig can find an acorn sometime. This had nothing to do with my business acumen, had nothing to do with how smart I was,
And I knew this was going to sell, it just happened to be dumb luck. So,
You've got something valuable here, though. You're over 1,000 slides in this slideshow. What?
oh, yeah, well, years ago, when I first, I was associated with the museum when it was in Roslyn, Virginia, and they borrowed my collection for their news history gallery. To make a long story short, when they moved into the new museum, which was in Washington DC, which was bought out by Hopkins School of Hygiene and is now Hopkins School of Public Health, in 2019, they wanted to buy my collection of best papers I had. Well, leading up to that, when I lent them my papers for their news history gallery, they would come into my dental office every Friday evening after my office closed, 5 o'clock. They'd send a photographer down, and I'd bring down 100, 200, 300 of the best papers, and they would photograph them because they wanted pictures of them. They wanted to digitize them, which they did. At that time, I didn't know what digitization was, but they were very smart. So you don't have to wait in front of the paper to see it. You actually can push it up on a screen that looks exactly like a huge cell phone at the old museum. You could do it, and you could push a button, and that newspaper would come up, and you could blow up the text to as big as you wanted, which is a great idea. So part of the deal was that in order for me to keep lending my papers to them for the news history gallery, that I was to get the photographs in slide form for all of these papers. And that's how I got the pictures. You can see
Okay,
here.
they didn't give you the digital file?
I'm sorry?
They didn't give you the digital file?
Interesting enough, they gave me slides because as a dentist, I was a periodontist, and I used to go out and give lectures on periodontal treatment and this sort of thing to dentists. And I was used to a Kodak carousel, you know. Oh my God, the bulb blew out, what am I going to do now? So the way that I copied them, I set up a carousel in my basement. Pictures were on the screen. I took a picture of them. And then and that's how they became slides. And then the slides became a PowerPoint presentation. My daughter, who at the time, she said, Dad, she said, why do you do this? Why don't you just take a little on PowerPoint? I said, what's PowerPoint? She told me what it was, and I got the program, and I started doing it, and I couldn't figure out how to use it. She said, I said, can you come over here and just show me how to use it? She said, Dad, just play around with it, you'll figure it out. I mean, there's nothing you can do that's gonna blow the machine up, you'll figure it out. And eventually I figured it out. And that's where these came from. These are photographs of the slides. That's why they're not as good as they would be if they were digitalization.
Do you still have the slides?
Yeah, I do actually. I do.
Because I took my father's slide collection, and it's a $25 machine that you can digitize.
That's what I was gonna say.
You can buy room.
Like writing a book.
Yes.
Yeah, I should do that, but I have so many other things to do in my life.
Tell your daughter to do it for a Christmas present.
Yes,
Could you tell us about one of your most surprising or exciting finds?
yes.
You're gonna run out of time for the people watching.
Okay,
So,
most exciting find. This is always my favorite. I was in my dental office and I was doing some surgery on a patient. And I got a call from a collector, actually from a dealer. And that dealer said to me, and so my secretary came in and said, so-and-so's on. And of course, I'm up to my, I was in blood, and I go to walk away. So I just tell him I'll call him back later. So I got finished surgery, I'm having the next patient was chair. So I called him back. And he said, hey, Steve, he says, you did some favors for us about a year ago. We got something here you might be interested in. What is it? We have a bound volume of the Las Vegas Gazette from 1881 with a broadside extra of the capture of Billy the Kid. Las Vegas, New Mexico is where Billy the Kid was active. This broadside is unknown. There's only one of them, and that was in that book. And he had the entire run of this. Okay. And how much you want for it? He told me, I said, I'll take it. I signed unseen, I said, I'll take it. Went back to treat patients. And that was one of my two best finds. Second best was, got a call from a dealer in Maryland, who again, if you've been in this business long enough, the dealers know you and they call you. People want to know where do these come from. It's like a dental friend of mine, Charlie Wallace. I used to say, where do your patients come from? He said the airport. They fly in to see him from like Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and all these places. And he called me and he said, I've got something here you might be interested in. What is it? He said it's a book called The Laws of Maryland, which is not a very interesting book, from 1790, but it has the Constitution of the United States in it. I said, I'll be down here tomorrow. Went down to his place in Southern Maryland. Next day, and he hands me this book, and I'm telling you, I nearly fainted. It was a book. The book is irrelevant. It was just a book. But inside, folded up, was held in with a piece of red sealing wax that somebody had actually put their sticky on.
Constitution.
Was the Maryland Journal Extraordinary, banner headline. Banner headline under that was a plan from the new federal government. I'm talking about banner headline. It's about that big, it's all folded up. How much you want for it? He told me. I said, I'll take it. Brought it back. I sent it to a restorer because it was folded up, so it had brown lines along where it's folded. So he restored it.
They just stuck it in another book.
It was folded up, stuck in the book.
But it wasn't bound in the book.
It was held in by sealing wax, but written in iron gall ink, brown iron gall ink. On the title page of the book, it says, Laws of Maryland, blah, 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 plus the Constitution of the United States, plus the Declaration of Independence.
It wasn't attachment.
It was the early printing, the earliest printing in Maryland of the Constitution in a broadside with a gorgeous headline, and it said, and the Declaration of Independence. I kept looking page by page. The Declaration was not there. And I asked the dealer, did you take it out? He said, no. He said, this is how I got the book. So somebody got the Declaration of Independence out of it. I got the Constitution out of it. In 1989, the federal government sent tractor trailers, 2 of them, to cities around the entire country for the 200th anniversary of the Constitution. And when they come to a local area like Annapolis, the local history group would have a portion of the tractor trailer where they would put local stuff. Ed Pappenfuss was the curator of the Maryland Archives at that time. He and I were friendly. He knew I had this. And he said, would you lend that to us to put into the tractor trailer? I said, sure, I'll lend it. So I lent it to him, and he put it in the display with some other stuff from Maryland. And when the tractor trailer left after about 3 days, he called me and said, can I keep this for like another 6 months or so and show it in the Maryland Archives? I said, yeah, you might as well. So he kept it for about 2 years afterwards. After tears, I said, you got to get this back to me. So those are the 2 best times. But the book I would like to write, the actual book I'd like to write, is my best finds and how I got them.
That would be interesting.
That is a very interesting book.
Because that would be interesting to collectors of a lot of it.
No question about it. There's a book out called
Sounds like
The
a
Island of Lost Maps. If you want to read a great book on collecting, it's called The Island of Lost Maps. It's about maps. It's not about newspapers. But everything in there is basically the same that I can relate to. And it talks about how people get them. It names dealers. It chastises dealers by name, which I love. And it's written by a guy who's going to write a book about collecting maps, but he thought it was so interesting about the interplay that goes on between dealers. It's like art dealers. When you walk into an art dealer's gallery, you see the pretty paintings up there. You don't see the backbiting and the stabbing that goes on in the background. This book was about the backstabbing and the backbiting and the terrible things that people say about each other. And it was just wonderful.
That sounds like next semester's class.
There you go. Well, thank you for coming. Thanks for being here. And we will see you next Tuesday at 4:30 to go up into the 19th and 20th sessions.
All right.